You stand in the elevator of Holloway Tower on the 42nd floor, smoothing down the sleeve of your blazer for the third time in 2 minutes, watching the numbers climb, and you feel the same tight coil in your stomach you've felt every single morning for the past 4 years. Today is the quarterly investor presentation. Today is the day Weston Radcliffe, CEO of Prendergast Analytics, will stand in front of the board and 12 major shareholders and present numbers that you built, projections that you modeled, and a 5-year growth strategy that came entirely out of your own late nights and weekend coffee and the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones now like a second skeleton. And today, like every day before it, your name will not be on a single slide. Your name is Idris Thackeray, and you are 34 years old. And for 4 years you have been called, in every meeting, in every hallway greeting, in every dismissive wave of Weston Radcliffe's hand, simply my assistant. It wasn't supposed to be this way. You came to Prendergast Analytics with a finance degree from a state school nobody in this building had ever heard of, hungry and sharp and desperate to prove that where you came from didn't determine what you were capable of. You started as an executive assistant because it was the only door that opened, and you told yourself, the way ambitious people do, that it was temporary, a foot in, a way to learn the machinery of the business from the inside, a stepping stone towards something larger. You did not know not then that some men will let you carry the weight of their entire company on your back and still introduce you to a room as though you were furniture that happened to also file paperwork. If you've ever worked twice as hard as the person getting the credit, if you've ever sat quietly at the back of a room, knowing you built everything on the table in front of everyone, stay with this one. Because what happens to Idris today is going to feel like something breaking open in your own chest. And if stories like this matter to you, go ahead and subscribe now, because we tell them every single week. You remember the early days almost fondly, in the way people remember pain that has since transformed into something useful. Weston Radcliffe had inherited the company from his father, a stiff, cold man who had built Prendergast Analytics from a 2-person consulting shop into a mid-size analytics firm before handing the reins to a son who understood golf courses and boardroom charm far better than he understood spreadsheets or client retention models. Weston was handsome in the practiced way of men who have never had to work particularly hard for anything, tall and silver-templed even in his early 40s, with a smile that photographed well for the company newsletter and a habit of taking credit for ideas the way other people take their morning coffee, automatically, without a second thought, as if it were simply owed to him. You started noticing it in your first year. A strategy memo you'd stayed up until 2 in the morning writing would appear the next day under Weston's name, forwarded to the board with his signature at the bottom and not a single mention of yours. A client retention model you built from scratch, the one that eventually saved the company's 3rd largest account from walking away entirely, became, in every subsequent conversation, something Weston had been working on for months. You told yourself it didn't matter. You told yourself that visibility would come eventually, that competence had its own gravity, that eventually the truth floats to the surface, the way it always does in the stories people tell each other to survive difficult jobs. It did not float to the surface. If anything, it sank further. Year after year, buried under the accumulated weight of Weston's comfort with the arrangement. You began doing more, not because anyone asked, but because someone had to. And increasingly, that someone was you. You built the quarterly financial models. You drafted the investor decks. You handled client relationships that Weston was too disengaged or too hungover to manage properly. You worked 60-hour weeks for an assistant's salary, and you watched Weston take long lunches at the club and long weekends at his lake house, secure in the knowledge that the machinery would keep running because you would not let it stop. The rising tension built slowly, the way pressure builds in a sealed container, invisible until the moment it isn't. 6 months ago, you developed the 5-year growth strategy that would become the centerpiece of today's investor presentation, an ambitious but carefully modeled plan to expand Prendergast Analytics into 2 new regional markets. Built on data you'd spent 4 months compiling, interviews you'd personally conducted with client prospects, and financial projections you'd stress-tested against 3 different economic scenarios. You presented it to Weston in his office on a Tuesday afternoon, watching his eyes glaze slightly over the technical details before landing, with sudden interest, on the projected revenue figures. "This is good," he'd said, tapping the deck with one manicured finger. "Really good. Idris, I want to walk the board through this myself at the quarterly meeting." "You should have said something then. You should have asked, at minimum, to be acknowledged as a contributor, to stand somewhere in the room while your own work was presented. Instead, you nodded, because 4 years of training had taught you that pushing back cost more than it was worth, that Weston's ego was a delicate ecosystem best left undisturbed, that your paycheck depended on his comfort more than it depended on your dignity. The breaking point arrived exactly as scheduled, in the glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor, at 10:15 in the morning, in front of the entire board of directors and 12 shareholders who represented, collectively, the majority of Prendergast Analytics' outside capital. You stood near the back of the room, as you always did, holding a tablet with backup data in case anyone had technical questions. Weston couldn't answer, invisible in the particular way that competent support staff learned to become invisible, present but unacknowledged, essential but unseen. Weston walked the board through your 5-year strategy with a confidence that would have been impressive if you hadn't known intimately that he barely understood half of what he was presenting. He stumbled, predictably, on a question from one of the shareholders, a sharp-eyed woman named Delphine Ashcombe, who represented one of the firm's largest institutional investors, about the underlying assumptions behind the second-year revenue projections. "I'd need to pull the detailed modeling to answer that precisely," Weston said, and then, without looking at you, without so much as a glance in your direction, he added, "My assistant can grab that for us. Idris, can you get Ms. Ashcombe the supplementary data?" It was such a small thing on its surface, a reasonable request in an ordinary meeting, but something in the way he said it, the casual dismissal, the total absence of your name attached to any actual contribution, the assumption baked so deeply into his tone that you existed in that room, purely as a retrieval system for his convenience, cracked something in you that 4 years of swallowed frustration had been quietly preparing to break. You stepped forward with the tablet, and Delphine Ashcombe, sharp and unbothered by hierarchy, in the way that only people with real capital tend to be, looked at you directly and asked, "Did you build this model yourself?" There was a pause, a long, terrible pause, in which you felt every eye in the room shift toward you, in which Weston's easy smile flickered just slightly, with something that might have been irritation, or might have been the first flush of panic. "I did," you said. Your voice came out steadier than you expected. "The full 5-year model, the regional expansion analysis, the client acquisition projections, the risk-adjusted scenarios. I built all of it." Weston laughed, a short, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh designed to reassert control over a room that had briefly slipped sideways. "Idris helps compile some of the supporting data," he said smoothly, addressing the board rather than you. "But the strategic framework, the overall vision, that's been months of my own work." You said nothing. What was there to say? In a room where the person controlling the narrative also controlled your paycheck. You handed Delphine Ashcombe the supplementary data, and you retreated to the back of the room, your face burning, your hands steady only through sheer force of will, and you thought, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, "This is the last time." You did not know, standing there in your quiet humiliation, that the ground beneath the entire company was already shifting, and that the shift had very little to do with Weston Radcliffe at all. 3 weeks earlier, in a conversation you were not privy to, Prendergast Analytics founding shareholder, Weston's own aging father, a man named Corwin Prendergast, who had stepped back from daily operations but retained a controlling interest in the firm, had quietly begun exploring a sale of his majority stake. Corwin had watched from a comfortable distance his son's steady erosion of the company's culture and performance over the better part of a decade, and he had grown tired of watching Weston coast on inherited credibility while the actual engine of the business ran on someone else's unacknowledged labor. Corwin had in fact noticed something else entirely, something Weston himself had never bothered to notice. Every substantive piece of work that crossed his desk for review over the past 2 years, every genuinely sharp piece of strategic analysis, carried buried in the file metadata the authorship of a single name, Idris Thackeray. Corwin Prendergast was not a sentimental man, but he was a careful one, and he had spent 30 years building an instinct for recognizing real talent underneath corporate noise. He had quietly reached out to a private equity group, and through a process that involved considerably more due diligence than Weston Radcliffe ever bothered to notice happening around him, Corwin had arranged to sell his controlling stake, not to an outside buyer, but into a newly structured ownership group designed specifically to correct what he saw as a decade of mismanagement. The paperwork had finalized 4 days before the investor meeting. Nobody in that boardroom, least of all Weston, knew that the deal had closed. Nobody except Corwin himself, and the small legal team that had structured the transaction, and the one condition Corwin had insisted on as part of the sale, that the largest single share of the newly restructured ownership go not to an outside executive, not to a competing firm, but to the person whose work Corwin had been quietly tracking for 2 years without her ever knowing she was being watched. You. The reveal came less than an hour after your humiliation in the boardroom, delivered not with theater or spectacle, but with the quiet, devastating simplicity of an email that appeared in your inbox during the lunch recess, forwarded from the company's general counsel, copying the full board of directors, Weston Radcliffe, and for the first time in 4 years, you as a primary recipient rather than an afterthought. The subject line read, "Ownership restructuring, effective immediately." You read it twice before you understood what you were looking at. Corwin Prendergast had sold his 61% controlling interest in Prendergast Analytics, the new majority shareholder, holding a controlling 44% stake structured through a private trust. Corwin had established specifically for this purpose was Idris Thackeray. You sat very still at your desk outside Weston's office, the email glowing on your screen, and you felt something in your chest that was not quite triumph and not quite disbelief, but some third thing entirely. The particular vertigo of watching the ground you'd stood on for 4 years reveal itself to have been something else entirely all along. Weston found out roughly the same moment you did, judging by the sound that came through his office door, a sharp, strangled exclamation followed by the scrape of his chair against the floor. He appeared in his doorway moments later, his face drained of its usual golf course tan, his phone still in his hand. "Idris," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the boardroom smoothness from an hour earlier.
Did you know about this?"
"No," you said, and it was the truth. "I found out exactly when you did." The afternoon that followed unfolded with the surreal slowness of a dream you can't quite wake from. The board reconvened hastily, this time with you seated not at the back of the room with a tablet, but at the head of the table. Corwin Prendergast himself appearing by video call from his home upstate to formally confirm the transition. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes about the company's future, about the importance of rewarding genuine contribution rather than inherited position, and then he said something that you would replay in your mind for months afterward, something that finally, after 4 years, put language to everything you had never been able to say for yourself. "I've watched this company's real work get done by one person for 2 years running," Corwin said, his voice steady through the video connection, while credit for that work went somewhere else entirely. "I'm too old to pretend that's an accident anymore, and I'm certainly too old to keep rewarding it." Idris Thackeray built the strategy that's kept this firm's most important accounts from walking away 3 separate times. Idris Thackeray built the 5-year plan being presented this morning as somebody else's vision. I don't intend to spend what's left of my working life watching that continue. Weston did not speak for the remainder of the meeting. He sat silent and pale, in a room he had walked into as the chief executive and would leave by the meeting's end, having been formally notified that his employment contract would be reviewed by the new majority shareholder, a review that would conclude within the month in a negotiated exit that stripped him of operational control while preserving a minority financial stake he had done nothing to earn beyond an accident of birth. You did not gloat. You found in the days that followed that vindication felt quieter and more complicated than you'd imagined during the years you'd spent rehearsing this moment in your head during long, unacknowledged nights of work. There was satisfaction, yes, sharp and real, but there was also the strange grief of realizing how much of yourself you had folded small to survive. 4 years in a role that had never valued you correctly, and the slower work of unlearning that particular smallness would take longer than any single boardroom reversal could fix. Delphine Ashcombe, the shareholder, whose sharp question had cracked the boardroom open in the first place, requested a private meeting with you within the week. She told you over coffee in a conference room that now, technically belonged partly to you, that she had suspected something was off in the company's leadership dynamics for over a year, and that watching you answer her question honestly, under pressure, in front of a room designed to make you disappear, had told her more about your character than any deck or model ever could. People show you who they are, she said, in the moment right before they think no one important is watching. You told the truth when it would have been easier not to. That matters more than you probably realize. You began slowly to reshape Prendergast Analytics into something closer to what you'd always believed the company could be, not through dramatic upheaval, but through the same patient, thorough work that had built the 5-year strategy in the first place. You restructured the compensation model so that analysts and associates received named credit on every deliverable they built. A small policy change that cost the company almost nothing and changed, immediately and permanently, the culture of quiet erasure that had defined your own early years there. You promoted 2 junior analysts whose sharp, uncredited work you had noticed over the years, the way Corwin Prendergast had once noticed yours. You did not fire everyone who had once looked past you in hallways or spoken over you in meetings. Some of them, you found, had simply been following the current of an ecosystem Weston had built around himself, and many adjusted with visible relief to a workplace where genuine contribution finally mattered more than proximity to the founder's son. A few did not adjust and left on their own, uncomfortable in a culture that no longer rewarded the specific kind of charm that had sustained Weston Radcliffe for a decade. Weston himself, in the months that followed his quiet ouster, sent you a single email, no apology exactly, but something adjacent to one, an acknowledgement, stiff and clearly uncomfortable to write, that he had perhaps not given appropriate recognition where it was due. You read it once and did not respond. Some doors, you had come to understand, did not need to be closed with ceremony. They simply needed to stay closed. You still work long hours at Prendergast Analytics, though the exhaustion feels different now, purposeful rather than extracted, chosen rather than assumed. You sit these days not at the back of boardrooms with a tablet in your hands, but at the head of the table, in the seat that was always, in every meaningful sense, already yours. It simply took the rest of the world 4 years to catch up to a truth you had known quietly, in the marrow of your own bones, the entire time. They called you just an assistant for 4 years, never once imagining that the woman they overlooked was the very foundation the entire company was standing on. And it only took one honest answer in one unguarded moment for the truth to finally take its rightful seat at the table.